Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Brooklyn, New York, February 11th, 2011. The city was just waking up, coffee pots steaming, buses pulling into intersections, and thousands of people preparing to disappear into the routine of a cold Friday. But for one home on East 27th Street, the morning wasn't routine. It was forensic chaos. NYPD dispatch received a 911 call at approximately 5:50 a.m. A neighbor had heard yelling, male voices, sharp, erratic, then silence. The dispatcher categorized it as a domestic disturbance. Units responded within minutes. When officers entered the residence, they found signs of forced tension, not forced entry. No broken locks, no shattered windows. But the front hallway told a story, one of sudden escalation. On the living room floor lay a middle-aged male, later identified as Alexander Kuznetsov, 54, pronounced dead at the scene. Multiple stab wounds primarily concentrated around the chest and neck. The wounds were deep, erratic, suggestive of personal rage rather than premeditated control. The weapon was missing. There was no ransacking, no attempt to conceal the body. Blood spatter reached the far wall, projected, not cast. That's how the crime scene unit phrased it in their initial field report. In a corner, officers noted a partially open closet door, with the victim's jacket still hung inside, meaning he hadn't been preparing to leave. A cup of tea was still warm on the table, untouched. There were no signs he'd anticipated a threat. His wife, Yelena Kuznetsova, was not home. Her Lexus sedan, normally parked in the shared driveway, was also gone. But she wasn't answering calls. The responding officers couldn't determine if she was safe, missing, or worse. They quickly learned something else. Yelena had a son from a previous marriage. His name was Maxim Gelman, 23. Known to local officers, not for violence, but for nuisance crimes, tagging subway cars, possession of controlled substances, occasional loitering. Nothing on his sheet suggested lethal capacity, but that morning his name jumped to the top of the working list. At 7:20 a.m., two detectives from the 61st Precinct canvassed the neighborhood. A neighbor, an older man who'd lived next door since the late 80s, mentioned hearing shouting around 5:30 a.m. Something about a car, he told them. Sounded like a young man yelling about getting the keys. Officers located a small security camera on a detached garage across the street. Grainy footage, time-stamped 5:41 a.m., showed a male figure entering the residence from the side door. 5 minutes later, a silver Lexus IS 300 pulled away with its headlights off. That footage didn't confirm Gelman's identity, but it aligned with his height and build. The Lexus was registered to Yelena. NYPD issued a BOLO for the vehicle at 7:48 a.m. Forensic sequence. Phase 1. Scene reconstruction. Crime scene unit began mapping the trajectory of blood patterns, pooling, and cast-off. There were 6 confirmed stab wounds visible on the body without even needing to roll it. The autopsy later confirmed 13, 3 of which punctured the heart. No defensive wounds were found on Alexander's arms or hands. The ME's report noted probable surprise assault from within close range. He was likely seated or standing still when the first blow landed. Luminol testing showed no blood outside the immediate area of the living room, which meant the killing occurred entirely in that space. No drag marks, no movement. This was fast, brutal, purpose-driven. Detective Rachel Gantz, who arrived on scene by 8:01 a.m., noted something else. A cell phone was left charging on the kitchen counter. Not Kuznetsov's. The wallpaper image was a young woman's selfie, later identified as Yelena Bulchenko, 20, unrelated to Kuznetsov, but connected to Maxim Gelman. That connection turned the case from domestic to volatile. In her preliminary interview, Yelena Kuznetsova, who was located hours later at a cousin's home, admitted that Maxim and Alexander had fought the night before. The dispute? The Lexus. Maxim had wanted to borrow it. Alexander refused. That was the last time she saw either of them. By 10 a.m., the case had shifted again. A second homicide was reported. In Sheepshead Bay, less than 2 miles from the first crime scene, police discovered the body of Anna Bulchenko, 56. She was found dead in her home, stabbed repeatedly. Blood pattern analysis showed signs of overkill. Forensics clocked the TOD, time of death, between 9:15 and 9:45 a.m. That's when the pieces began to line up. Anna was Yelena Bolchenko's mother. And Yelena? She hadn't been seen since that morning. Her phone had been found, but she hadn't. The connection between the two scenes, already circumstantial, was now urgent. Forensic sequence. Phase 2, digital footprint. Analysts pulled the call logs from Yelena Bolchenko's recovered phone. The last outgoing text was time-stamped 9:07 a.m. Just got to mom's. Something's not right. Smells like bleach? That message was never sent. It was typed, auto-saved, but not delivered. An unsent text. No signs of forced entry, 2 homicides, and 1 suspect with access to both homes, both victims and both timelines. The NYPD didn't go public with the name yet, not officially, but internally Maxim Gelman was now a murder suspect. His name was placed on the NYS alert system. By 11:45 a.m., they knew the Lexus had been spotted in East Flatbush. A traffic cam pinged the license plate moving through Utica Avenue. They traced it, but it was too late. He'd already abandoned it. She told friends he was obsessive. She said he wouldn't let go, but no one thought it would escalate, not to this. At approximately 10:36 a.m. on February 11, 2011, NYPD received a 911 call from a neighbor at 2400 East 24th Street in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. The caller reported hearing a young woman scream, followed by silence. Officers responded and entered through the unlocked front door. There were no signs of forced entry or burglary. Nothing was broken, and the house was largely undisturbed, except for the hallway, where they found the body of Anna Bolchenko, 56, lying face down in a rapidly expanding pool of blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and upper abdomen. The medical examiner's initial field report noted deep penetrating wounds with angled entry points, suggesting close contact. There were no defensive injuries. The absence of hesitation wounds indicated the attacker acted with intent and without pause. Anna was most likely turning away from someone she recognized when the first strike landed. She was barefoot, still wearing a house robe. The positioning of the body facing toward the kitchen implied she was moving at the time of the attack. Near the kitchen counter, officers located the home's landline off the hook. Call logs confirmed that Anna had dialed 911 at 10:12 a.m., but the call never completed. The line went dead seconds after connection. That timestamp narrowed the window of attack considerably. Detectives noted the odd detail that her purse was still zipped and placed near the stairs. Her phone remained untouched on the table. A framed family photo of Anna and her daughter Yelena sat undisturbed nearby. Nothing was missing. No valuables, no electronics, no cash. This wasn't a robbery, it was a targeted strike. Back at precinct headquarters, analysts were already working to align timelines between the 2 murder scenes. Kuznetsov's house on East 27th Street and now the Bolchenko residence. Surveillance footage from Kings Highway and Ocean Avenue captured the same silver Lexus IS 300, previously reported stolen and linked to the Kuznetsov homicide, moving toward Sheepshead Bay at 9:41 a.m. The vehicle disappeared from traffic cams between 9:46 and 10:08 a.m. At 10:03 a.m., it reappeared heading southbound. That 22-minute blind spot now overlapped directly with Anna's time of death. Investigators obtained partial surveillance footage from a home 2 properties down. A low-resolution black-and-white image, time-stamped 9:57 a.m., showed a male subject entering the Bolchenko property from the rear alley. No face, no distinct features. But the shoes were visible. Black and white Adidas sneakers, left foot clearly worn at the toe. That same shoe tread was documented at the first scene on East 27th, collected in blood near the Kuznetsov living room. NYPD then re-examined the connection to Yelena Bolchenko, 20, who had already been tied to the investigation. Her phone was found at the Kuznetsov scene. Now her mother was dead, but Yelena herself was missing. Phone records showed that her last device activity occurred at 9:08 a.m. when her phone pinged a cell tower along Voorhees Avenue. At 9:14 a.m., the signal dropped. It wasn't a shutdown, it was a complete cutoff. That suggested abrupt physical destruction. Officers canvassing nearby drainage found shards of tempered glass and a partially crushed iPhone casing in a street-level sewer grate. Serial identification later confirmed it belonged to Yelena. From there, the case shifted. Yelena was no longer a witness. She was officially declared a critically missing person. Alerts were issued citywide. Her photo circulated across digital billboards, precinct watch lists, and news channels. What investigators didn't understand yet was whether Yelena had escaped or been taken. The house showed no evidence of a struggle, no blood, no personal belongings missing. It was as if she had never arrived, except she had. A draft text message on her phone, recovered from the device's cloud backup, read, "Just got to Mom's. Something's not right. Smells like bleach?" Timestamp 9:07 a.m. The message was never sent. Police now had a rapidly moving subject, a dead stepfather, a murdered mother, and a missing daughter. All signs pointed to one man, Maxim Gelman. But by the time the search zone shifted, Gelman was no longer in the Lexus. That vehicle had been spotted at 10:48 a.m. on Ocean Parkway, then vanished. Just over an hour later, at 12:05 p.m., a new 911 call came in from Coney Island Avenue. A 60-year-old man named Arthur DeCrescento had been stabbed multiple times during a violent attempted carjacking. DeCrescento survived. When stabilized at Coney Island Hospital, he described his attacker as a white male, early 20s, hoodie up with a wild, vacant expression. He had demanded the car, shoved him aside, and stabbed him while shouting, "I need your car. I need to finish something." DeCrescento was shown a photographic lineup. He pointed at Gelman immediately. "That's him. He didn't even blink." The car stolen from DeCrescento was a 1995 green Pontiac Bonneville. As of 1 p.m., it had not been recovered. Gelman was once again mobile and more volatile than ever. The nature of the victims had shifted. Alexander Kuznetsov and Anna Bulchenko were personal connections. But DeCrescento was a stranger. That change in target profile escalated the case from targeted homicide to spree-level violence. Analysts noted the sudden shift in threat behavior. Gelman was no longer selecting victims based on personal grievance. He was now eliminating anyone in his way. A tactical bulletin was issued to NYPD citywide. The suspect was armed with a bladed weapon, known to use stolen vehicles, had committed at least 2 confirmed homicides, 1 attempted murder, and was now suspected of holding a hostage or body in unknown status. Access to mass transit systems in densely populated areas was considered high risk. What had started as a contained domestic homicide had now evolved into a mobile manhunt involving multiple precincts, traffic surveillance units, and aviation support. Still missing was the person who might have been the next victim, or already was. By early afternoon on February 11, 2011, the scope of the violence unfolding across Brooklyn had expanded beyond anything NYPD detectives had anticipated that morning. What began as 2 murders within personal proximity had now veered into indiscriminate bloodshed. The suspect was no longer moving through connections. He was moving through the city itself, randomly, violently, and without apparent endgame. At 1:42 p.m., an automated license plate reader picked up a green Pontiac Bonneville traveling southbound along Ocean Parkway. The vehicle was confirmed as stolen, matching the earlier carjacking involving Arthur DeCrescento, who had survived a brutal knife attack only hours prior. 8 minutes later, NYPD received a call about a pedestrian being struck near Avenue U and East 17th Street. The caller stated that the car came out of nowhere and that the driver never slowed down. Emergency medical services responded within minutes. The victim, identified as 62-year-old Stephen Tannenbaum, was found with severe cranial and thoracic trauma. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Witnesses described the vehicle accelerating before impact, maintaining speed after the collision, and disappearing down a side street. Surveillance footage retrieved from a nearby electronics repair shop confirmed what witnesses had seen. The car didn't hesitate. The suspect didn't brake. This wasn't an accident, it was an execution. Tannenbaum was not connected to any of the prior victims. He wasn't a friend, a neighbor, or a known associate of the suspect. He was a retired school administrator walking to visit a friend. His killing marked a shift. Targeting no longer followed logic or history. For investigators, that transition was critical. When a killer moves from targeted violence to spontaneous aggression, the urgency of containment escalates dramatically. Now, any person walking the street could be next. The NYPD crime scene unit examined the scene immediately. Tire impressions were collected using standard casting methods. Those prints were later matched to the Bonneville's right rear tire, which had a distinctive sidewall tear. That damage had been noted in traffic camera footage from earlier in the day. The same vehicle had been recorded driving away from the DiCrescento attack site, and now from this latest scene. Investigators traced the Bonneville's movement via surrounding security feeds and confirmed its trajectory matched the hit-and-run route. It was further confirmation that the person behind the wheel was maintaining momentum, moving in straight, aggressive lines through residential zones without any discernible pattern. By mid-afternoon, NYPD requested behavioral support from the FBI's regional unit. The working profile now categorized the suspect as an active spree offender operating under mission-oriented delusion with escalating unpredictability. Analysts noted the rapid transition from family-related homicide to random killing as a red flag commonly associated with identity disintegration, cases where the perpetrator begins to dissolve the boundaries between grievance and general hostility. The message, if there was one, was not being broadcast. It was being carved directly into the city. Analysts also revisited digital traces. Since the morning, there had been no sign of electronic activity linked to the suspect, no phone signal, no financial transactions, no camera footage showing him outside of the stolen vehicle. The suspect had, in effect, removed himself from the grid. NYPD cybercrime teams ran geofence sweeps across areas of interest, but without new data points, nothing could be triangulated. There was no clear digital trail to follow. Detectives began to suspect the deliberate destruction of any traceable device. Meanwhile, a third crime scene had been confirmed. 3 fatalities within 8 hours, each involving a different method of murder, a stabbing, a repeat stabbing, and now vehicular homicide. Each incident occurred in a different neighborhood, with no shared location and no known co-conspirators. The weapon had changed, but the pattern had not. The intent was not concealment. It was maximum damage in minimum time. The body of Stephen Tannenbaum was taken to the medical examiner's office just after 4 p.m. Autopsy findings were consistent with high-speed vehicular impact, rib fractures, multiple contusions, and fatal blunt force trauma to the head. Traces of asphalt and automotive debris were recovered from his clothing. Toxicology was clear. There were no substances in his system. He had simply been walking across the street when the car hit him head-on. He never saw it coming. Detectives canvassed the surrounding blocks for witnesses. Several reported seeing the Bonneville driving aggressively earlier that hour, swerving between lanes and nearly clipping another vehicle. One shop owner described the driver as calm, like he wasn't even thinking. That detail was noted not for psychological diagnosis, but for operational concern. A calm killer was often more dangerous than a panicked one. Calm meant control. Control meant strategy. And strategy, even flawed, was harder to intercept. By evening, NYPD had issued a Level 2 mobilization. All officers in affected precincts were instructed to report any sighting of the Bonneville immediately. Alerts were transmitted to the Metropolitan Transit Authority and Port Authority. Local hospitals were contacted to check for any admissions matching the suspect's appearance or wound profile. The manhunt had now entered its most critical stage, but the vehicle remained in motion, and the suspect was still making decisions faster than the system could adapt. What the city didn't know yet was that the next location wouldn't be a house or a sidewalk. It would be a subway, and there, the next body wouldn't fall easily. By February 12, 2011, at approximately 1 a.m., the search for the suspect had entered its 19th hour. 3 individuals were confirmed dead, and another 3 had survived violent, unprovoked attacks. The green Pontiac Bonneville had not been recovered. Surveillance from the previous afternoon ended at a gas station on Neptune Avenue. After that, there was no visual contact, no digital trace, and no verifiable witness sighting. NYPD had reason to believe the suspect was operating within proximity to transit corridors, possibly preparing to leave the borough. With no cell phone activity and no financial transactions to track, the subway system, specifically the Q line running from Coney Island through Brooklyn into Manhattan, became a primary focus for field units. At 1:02 a.m., Joseph Lucido boarded the northbound 3 train at Penn Station. He had just finished work and was heading home to Queens. He chose the first car, less crowded, quieter. A few other passengers occupied the space, none of them interacting. Security footage from the station platform showed another male entering the same car seconds before the doors closed. The man had a hoodie pulled over his head, kept his left hand tucked against his side, and avoided eye contact. At that time, no passengers recognized him. Roughly 3 minutes into the ride between 34th Street and Times Square, the suspect initiated the next attack. Without speaking, he lunged at Lucido with a knife, attempting a direct facial slash. Lucido sustained a deep cut across his head, but managed to react immediately. He grabbed the suspect's arm, tackled him to the ground, and pinned him despite additional wounds to his shoulder and hands. Other passengers moved away. None intervened. The train operator notified transit control, and NYPD officers, already stationed at Times Square due to the citywide alert, responded when the train arrived. They entered the car and took the suspect into custody without resistance. The knife was recovered from the floor, coated in fresh blood. Lucido, still bleeding, identified the man on the spot. The arrest marked the end of a 28-hour killing spree that had left 4 dead and multiple others wounded across Brooklyn and Manhattan. During his arrest, the suspect made no confession. Instead, he reportedly muttered, "I had a doozy of a day," and refused further comment. His injuries included several self-inflicted cuts on his hands, which investigators later attributed to weapon slippage during the stabbings. Back at the precinct, detectives processed the suspect's clothing. Blood from at least 3 different victims was found on the sleeves, shoes, and waistline of his jeans. DNA analysis over the following weeks confirmed matches to Tannenbaum, DeCrescento, and Lucido. No gloves were recovered, no mask. There had been no effort to conceal identity or intent. The knife itself was traced to a local hardware store in Bensonhurst, where security logs showed a purchase 2 days prior by an individual resembling the suspect. Transaction records were paid in cash, no card or ID used. Though circumstantial, the timeline aligned closely with the first murder. At 6:30 a.m., the suspect was formally charged with multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and criminal possession of a weapon. Additional charges were pending toxicology results, forensic mapping, and witness testimony. NYPD officials held a press conference later that morning. The department confirmed the arrest, outlined the scope of the crimes, and credited Lucido's actions for potentially saving lives. What stood out in this case beyond the brutality was the shift in geography. The violence began inside homes, moved into the streets, and ended inside a train. Each environment required a different tactical response. Each location left behind different forms of evidence. But the intent never changed. Lucido was treated at Bellevue Hospital and released later that day. He received 15 stitches and 2 cracked bones in his face. Despite the trauma, he gave a full statement to investigators and did not request protective anonymity. His cooperation was integral to solidifying the prosecution's timeline. This chapter of the investigation also raised internal questions. The NYPD Transit Bureau had received alerts about the suspect earlier that day. Officers were stationed at key platforms, but they were not inside the train car when the stabbing began. Later reviews of the response time confirmed that while the train operator alerted control quickly, the officers were not positioned to prevent the assault, only to detain after the fact. It was a detail that would later spark debate about public safety, transit surveillance, and real-time threat detection. In a city as large as New York, it's nearly impossible to be everywhere at once. But in this case, response lag nearly cost another life. The man responsible had traveled across boroughs, changed weapons, changed vehicles, changed methods. But he never changed direction. From the first stabbing to the last lunge, everything pointed forward. When the NYPD took Maxim Gelman into custody in the early morning hours of February 12, 2011, the physical violence had stopped. But the real examination had just begun. The task was no longer to locate a moving suspect, but to make sense of a trail of violence that, until then, had no clearly defined motive, no manifesto, and no coherent trigger. The suspect was processed at the Midtown South Precinct. He showed no signs of intoxication, no visible disorientation, and no attempt to justify or contextualize his actions. He refused a formal statement. His demeanor remained flat. When asked directly about the events of the past 28 hours, he offered a dismissive response. "I had a doozy of a day." That was the only complete sentence recorded during initial intake. Detectives initiated a full background investigation within the hour. Gelman, age 23, was born in Ukraine and emigrated to the U.S. with his mother in the early 1990s. He became a U.S. citizen in 2005. He had no known history of psychiatric treatment, no history of diagnosed mental illness, and no active prescriptions on file. His arrest record showed minor nonviolent offenses: graffiti, marijuana possession, disorderly conduct, but nothing that suggested a capacity for lethal violence. That disconnect became the focus. Investigators needed to understand what changed. They began by reconstructing his last 72 hours. Surveillance footage placed him at a local hardware store 2 days prior, where he purchased a large kitchen knife, consistent in blade size and serration pattern with the weapon used at the first murder scene. The purchase was made in cash. No store loyalty card, no conversation with the cashier. He walked in, selected the item, paid, and left. According to time-stamped CCTV, he was in and out in under 4 minutes. This was not a crime of passion. It was not impulsive. That decision, weapon selection in advance of conflict, reframed the case. Whatever else Gelman might claim, the record showed planning. That made the first attack more than a reaction to an argument. It made it the first step in a sequence. In the days leading up to the killings, Gelman had also made multiple attempts to contact Yelena Bulchenko, the young woman who had previously described him as obsessive. Friends later confirmed that she had blocked him on all social media platforms. Records showed he had created 3 new online profiles using alternate email addresses to view her pages and send repeated messages. None were threatening on the surface, but the volume and persistence stood out. Investigators pulled search history from Gelman's home computer, recovered from the apartment he shared with his mother. One entry, logged less than 24 hours before the killings began, read, "How to make someone pay." That was followed by "Knife Laws NYC Subway." The queries weren't elaborate, they were direct, focused. There was no manifesto because he didn't need one. He wasn't broadcasting to the world. He was targeting specific people, and then moving on. Forensic analysis of his clothing and the knife recovered from the subway car confirmed what field investigators already knew. Blood samples matched the victims. Trace fibers from the seat of the Pontiac Bonneville were recovered from his jeans. Lint and hair fragments from Yelena Bulchenko's jacket, later found near a dumpster 2 blocks from her mother's house, were embedded in the cuff of his hoodie. He had been with her that morning. Where her body was at that time remained unknown. During a secondary search of the Bonneville, located 2 days after his arrest in an underground lot in Brighton Beach, officers discovered a partial palm print on the inside of the rear passenger window. The print matched Yelena. The trunk contained signs of recent cleaning. Chemical tests revealed faint traces of blood, though not enough to determine whether she had been killed there. That part of the case remained open. To build a prosecutable case, investigators needed to establish intent, particularly in the absence of a confession. Motive wasn't legally required, but it shaped narrative, and narrative mattered in court. The timeline had already been mapped. The physical evidence aligned. But the why remained blurred. A forensic psychiatrist was brought in to evaluate Gelman 3 days after the arrest. The assessment found no signs of active psychosis, delusional disorder, or cognitive impairment that would meet the legal threshold for insanity. Gelman understood what he had done. He simply didn't care. When asked about remorse, he replied, "They got what they had coming." In the absence of diagnosable mental illness, the explanation defaulted to conduct. He exhibited traits of antisocial personality disorder, impulsivity, lack of empathy, inflated sense of grievance. But he met the legal standard of competency. He would stand trial. The broader impact of the case had already begun to emerge. The city's transit system reviewed its real-time alert protocols after it was revealed that internal notices about Gelman's potential presence on subway lines were not relayed to every conductor. Officers were stationed at platforms, but none had been inside the train car where Joseph Lazita was attacked. That detail became a point of public discussion and policy reform. At the community level, the families of the victims were navigating parallel lives, one of loss, one of procedural delay. Anna Bulchenko's funeral was held quietly, away from the press. Yelena's family was still waiting for a body to bury. Stephen Tannenbaum's widow requested privacy and declined all interviews. The city mourned collectively, but justice would move in increments. Cases like this don't end at arrest. They fracture in all directions. For the justice system, the job was to account for every movement, every detail, and to present the full weight of what happened, without embellishment, without omission. That's where meaning exists, not in speculation, but in evidence. Maxim Gelman's trial didn't begin with a surprise. It began with a plea. In November 2011, just 9 months after his arrest, Gelman stood in a New York courtroom and pled guilty to all charges: murder, attempted murder, and assault. The decision to avoid trial wasn't strategic. It was consistent with his behavior from the moment of arrest. Unapologetic, uncooperative, and detached. He waived his right to trial by jury. There would be no cross-examination, no contested evidence, and no opportunity for the public to hear testimony firsthand. The facts were already established. Gelman didn't dispute any of them. His defense team presented no mitigating evidence, no psychiatric claim, no appeal for leniency. They acknowledged the severity of his crimes and made no argument for reduced sentencing. Prosecutors, in response, outlined the events in detail, using forensic evidence to reinforce what had already been determined through investigation. The sequence of attacks was laid out clearly: 4 murders, multiple stabbings, vehicular homicide, and attempted murder on a subway car. Blood evidence, DNA, witness identification, and security footage collectively formed a prosecution that didn't require embellishment. It required clarity, and that's what the court delivered. During sentencing, victim impact statements were read aloud. Family members described the aftermath, not just the loss of life, but the vacuum left behind. Stephen Tannenbaum's son recounted identifying his father's body at the morgue. Anna Bulchenko's sister expressed anger at how quickly a home could become a crime scene. Joseph Losito, the survivor who had subdued Gelman in the subway, declined to make a statement in court, but later told press that the system didn't stop him, a civilian did. That remark triggered brief public debate about NYPD's response timeline, but it didn't alter the court's conclusion. The sentencing was swift. Gelman was given the maximum, 200 years to life, with no possibility of parole. The judge made it clear there was no reason to believe he could ever re-enter society. Gelman did not react. He smiled briefly when the sentence was read, then looked down and said nothing. He was removed from the courtroom without incident. No trial meant limited press coverage. No testimony meant no cross-examination of experts. What remained were court transcripts, forensic reports, and a closed loop of evidence that never had to prove itself under crossfire. That absence left some families unsatisfied. They wanted questions answered. Why these victims? Why that day? But the legal process had no room for unprovable motive. It had facts, and those were enough to convict. After sentencing, Gelman was transferred to the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. Known for housing violent offenders, the facility placed him in administrative segregation. Forensic psychologists submitted final notes indicating that while he met markers for antisocial behavior, there was no clinical diagnosis to exempt him from standard sentencing. He had demonstrated full awareness of his actions and their consequences. Law enforcement closed the case file with a completed chain of evidence. No outstanding leads, no unsolved components. Yelena Bulchenko's body had not been recovered, but forensic indicators, blood DNA from Gelman's clothes, hair fibers, and the palm print inside the Pontiac, left little doubt. Prosecutors included her name among the victims during sentencing, and the court accepted her as a confirmed fatality based on the totality of evidence. In the months that followed, NYPD's internal reviews led to new deployment guidelines for violent suspect alerts on transit systems. Officers would now rotate within train cars during active manhunts, not remain on platforms. It was a procedural adjustment that came too late for Losito, but one that aimed to prevent the same vulnerability in the future. The case entered textbooks and police training modules, not for its legal complexity, but for its escalation curve. Investigators use it as a reference for identifying transition points in spree offenses. From targeted domestic murder to indiscriminate public violence, the case illustrates how quickly a contained threat can evolve when missed. The families went home with court orders, but no resolution. There's no closure when someone disappears into the justice system as silently as they move through the streets. In the end, the impact of this case wasn't measured in headlines. It was measured in the absence it left behind. The city didn't return to normal after Maxim Gelman's arrest. It adjusted, quietly, cautiously, and in pieces. While the legal outcome had been conclusive, the broader effects of the 28-hour rampage left no clean division between crime and recovery. What happened on February 11 and 12, 2011, didn't just end with a prison sentence, it left gaps in lives, in public trust, and in systems designed to prevent what no one thought would happen. In the immediate aftermath, New York's transit system conducted an internal audit of all emergency alert procedures. The conclusion was clear. Platform presence wasn't enough. When suspects were believed to be inside trains, officers needed to be inside cars. Starting in mid-2012, deployment protocols were updated. Uniformed officers began rotating between cars on active watch lists. It was a procedural adjustment, but a critical one. In high-density systems, timing matters more than manpower. The NYPD also revised how it escalated suspect warnings across precincts. Before, alerts traveled through layers of command. Now, real-time suspects in violent crimes would trigger push notifications through precinct-wide mobile units. It was a technological shift meant to close the time gap exposed by Gelman's mobility. The delay between identification and confrontation had cost lives. That wouldn't be allowed again without scrutiny. In Brooklyn neighborhoods where the attacks took place, physical traces of the crime vanished quickly. Blood was cleaned from sidewalks. Police tape came down. But the emotional aftermath stayed with residents. On East 24th Street, neighbors left flowers in front of the Bulchenko home for months. At Avenue U, a mural was painted in memory of Stephen Tannenbaum. The community response wasn't organized, it was spontaneous. Small, local actions in the absence of institutional closure. The victims' families handled grief differently. Yelena Bulchenko's family continued searching for her remains even after the court accepted her death. They hired private search teams. They revisited the area near where her belongings had been found. No remains were recovered. The absence extended her suffering into a second form, ambiguity. That kind of loss doesn't stabilize with time. It reopens every time it's mentioned. Joseph Lozito, the man who stopped Gelman on the train, received media attention in the weeks following the arrest. Interviews focused on his injuries, his reaction, and the police delay in helping. But Lozito's case also triggered broader discussion about the expectations placed on civilians in life-threatening situations. While his actions were heroic, his public stance was clear. He shouldn't have had to act alone. 1 year after the attacks, Lozito filed a civil lawsuit against the NYPD for failure to intervene during the attack. The case drew attention, but was ultimately dismissed. The ruling stated that police had no special duty to protect an individual from harm unless a special relationship existed. It was a legal interpretation, not a moral one. And for many in the city, it reinforced a truth they already understood. Safety was shared, but not guaranteed. Law enforcement agencies across the state began using the Gelman case in officer training. It became part of a larger conversation around spree behavior, specifically the transition point between personal grievance and public threat. Experts use the case to illustrate how behavior escalates when intervention doesn't occur early. Missed warnings, whether digital, social, or behavioral, compound risk. At a broader level, the case led to questions about mental health intervention in urban communities. Gelman had not been diagnosed with any disorder that required reporting or treatment, but his behavior, obsessive tracking, aggressive fixation, social isolation, had been visible. In hindsight, multiple people described feeling unsettled by his presence. No one reported it. The case became a reference point in campaigns urging the public to flag early warning signs before a threat materialized. Despite the clear-cut legal resolution, what remained was the awareness that a city as large and watched as New York could still be caught off guard. No surveillance camera, no officer on patrol, no court sentence could reverse what happened, but each could be adjusted to reduce the next time. This wasn't about fear, it was about pattern recognition. What happened in those 28 hours showed how quickly violence can escalate when no one steps in early, and how, even in a city built on resilience, The aftermath can echo longer than expected. The violence ended when Maxim Gelman was arrested, but the case didn't close for the systems that failed to see it coming. In the months following the attacks, investigators reviewed not only what happened, but how little stood in the way of it. What emerged wasn't a new crime pattern. It was an old weakness. Signs noticed too late, by too many people, with no obligation to act. Gelman had no criminal convictions involving violence before the spree. He had prior arrests, but none that triggered mandatory psychological evaluation. He wasn't flagged in school, in court, or by neighbors. He wasn't on any watch list, but he had left a trail: obsessive behavior, digital harassment, erratic online posts, and isolation that had worsened over time. None of it was actionable. All of it was visible. Law enforcement professionals, after reviewing the case, acknowledged a central flaw. There was no mechanism to connect scattered warnings into a cohesive alert. What seemed minor to individuals became significant in retrospect. But no single agency or person held enough of the picture to act, and the law, as written, protected Gelman's right to spiral until he broke it. Post-incident, the NYPD introduced integrated alerts between precincts and MTA units. Suspect descriptions, once relayed through layered chain of command, were now streamlined through mobile dispatch. Transit patrols began boarding trains, not just monitoring platforms. The system shifted from passive surveillance to predictive presence. At a community level, the attacks pushed mental health awareness into sharper focus. Posters encouraging bystander reporting appeared in city buildings. Public service campaigns emphasized that early warning signs should not be dismissed, even if they aren't yet crimes. The message wasn't about paranoia, it was about timing. For those closest to the victims, time moved differently. Yelena Bolchenko's family never recovered her body. That unresolved grief shaped every response, every memory. Anna's house was eventually sold. Stephen Tannenbaum's name was added to a small plaque at a local community center. These were gestures, not answers. Joseph Lozito resumed life quietly. The lawsuit was dismissed and no apology was ever issued. But his testimony remains part of police training materials. He became an unwilling case study in what happens when public protection fails, and what individual instinct, at the worst possible moment, can prevent. Internally, some detectives who worked the case admitted that it changed how they read threats. No longer was harmless eccentricity ignored. Patterns were logged faster, behavioral risk flagged earlier. It didn't require fear, just attention. Gelman's case is now taught less for how it ended and more for how it began, with signs ignored not because they were invisible, but because no one believed they connected. Not every crime can be prevented, but when tragedy moves faster than the systems meant to detect it, prevention becomes the only measure worth improving. In this case, the facts were solved. The consequences remain. I've shared this story not just to recount what happened, but to remind us what can happen when warning signs are ignored and systems fail to connect. As someone who's seen what violence looks like when it erupts without warning, I hope you walk away with more than just shock. I hope you walk away with awareness. If someone around you seems off, obsessive, unstable, say something. Trust your instincts. What you report could be what prevents the next tragedy. If this video moved you, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from or how this story hit you. If you didn't connect with it, I'd love to hear why. Either way, you're part of the conversation. And if you want more real stories that matter, subscribe to this channel. Stay informed, stay safe, stay connected.